again. You got the equation y equals the value right here, and it's either sine or cosine. And then there's a value right here, and there's an x, there's plus, and then there's a value over here. So when we think about all of these pieces, let's label them. We're going to label this A, we're going to label this value B, we're going to label this value C, and that'll help us solve those. So A stands for the amplitude. It's you can find it a couple different ways. You could take the highest value minus the lowest value and divide it by 2, split it in half. That's how you could find the amplitude. Or you could figure out the highest distance from the midline. That would be another way you could deal with the amplitude. You could figure out the amplitude by saying, okay, well, what's the highest and what's the lowest value on this thing? And then divide it by 2, and then that's going to get that, that amplitude. The midline is found by this part. This is the midline. That's the horizontal line that runs through the middle. Okay, it just runs right through the middle. It's the horizontal line that runs right through the middle. The hardest one to deal with is that value B. That's the period. Okay, so that value B is what I had termed as the period adjuster, but that's really the period. That's how the period is determined. What you need to know is the period, which remember, that is one cycle, is equal to 2 pi divided by that B value. That's how big the period is, 2 pi divided by whatever that value is. The period is just one cycle. So you can go through, and I'm going to do some of these examples, but make sure you know these are the kind of the main characteristics of the ideas behind these equations, or this sine cosine equation. Before I go through, remember that the parent function of the sine looks like this. It starts at 0, goes up to 1. That's at pi over 2. Goes back down to 0 at pi. Goes down to -1 at 3 pi over 2. And then returns back to 0 at 2 pi. And so the sine curve kind of goes like this and runs right through there. That's what the sine curve looks like. Whereas the cosine graph has a similar idea, but it starts at 1, goes down to 0 at pi over 2, goes down to -1 at pi, returns to 0 at 3 pi over 2, and then goes back up to 1 to finish it off at 2 pi to make one cycle. Kind of goes down like this, around and up, and right there. Pretend I went through that point there. So that's the cosine graph. So you got the sine and the cosine graph. They look similar, but they're a little bit different. So take a look at a problem like this from your assignment. Here's this one, and it's asking for the period. Well, notice that the period for this. If you started here at 0 and it goes up, reaches a peak, it's a sine curve, comes back down to 0, then goes back down to the valley, and then comes back up and stops right there, and then it repeats again. So notice that that period is pi over 2. So pi divided by 2. Okay, that's the period on that one, and it'll go through and show you that's the period. Okay, so those are the first easy one. We did these before, where you're adjusting this. This is the amplitude, how high up. So notice, I could come up with this amplitude. So this goes from -4 to -2. That's a span of 2, which means the amplitude is just 1. And you can come up with the period. Notice this is a cosine graph. This is the parent cosine graph. So I know I could put in 1 here. This graph, the period of this dotted line goes all the way over here to 2 pi, which would make this 1. And this graph is dropped down 3 units. So if I put -3 in here, I should get, it should match up with me. Bingo, there it matches up with me. Okay, we did some of those. Determine the minimum and maximum value. Okay, so let's think about what this would look like. If I think about the minimum and maximum on this, if I know that this is the equation f of x is equal to -5 sine 1/3 x minus 15. The amplitude is equal to 5. But the graph, the midline, is y equals -15. That means we go 5 higher than -15, so the maximum would be -15 plus 5, and the minimum would be -15 minus 5. So we go 5 away from -15, so the maximum will be -10, the minimum would be -20. And just to show you that solution, that's what they do in here, and you can see what happened there. So you can get that. Determine the period from the trig function. Now this is the trickiest part. And let me, okay, so I'm just making sure that they give you these problems in the right way. Okay, so determine the period. So here's this function. Remember, the period is 2 pi divided by whatever that b value is, whatever that number is in front of x. Notice this number in front of x is 8/3. So if we wanted to write, I'm going to check something with Delta Math just to see if they'll let me do it. But on this one, when you have the equation y equals 2 sine 8/3 x, this is that b value. So our period is equal to 2 pi divided by 8/3. I don't know if they'll let me put 2 pi divided by 8/3. They might, but remember that that's equal to 2 pi times 3/8, because you could multiply by the reciprocal, which is 6 pi divided by 8, and they're probably going to reduce it, but I'm going to try something. I'm going to try to put in 2 pi divided by 8/3, and I don't know if they're going to let me do that, but we're going to give it a shot and see what they say. So they went through and said my answer is not simplified. So notice they went through, and that's the same value. That's what I came up with over here, 6/8. So they're going to ask you to simplify it. So just go through the steps to simplify it. Reduce this fraction to 3 pi over 4, and that would have been the answer that I should have put in there. So you are going to have to reduce that. The last one is a little tricky, and I'm going to do my best to kind of explain this one, but let's look at this one. So we got this equation, y equals 3 sine 5/4 x minus 1. So if we start to think about the pieces of this, we know that the midline is equal to y equals -1. So we know this thing drops down 1. We know our amplitude is equal to 3. We know that since it's a sine graph, it's got to look like that. So the only thing we got to kind of figure out is how does this number right here adjust our period? That means our period is equal to 2 pi divided by 5/4. Okay, so if we do a little math on that, that's a little simplifying on that. That's 2 pi 1 times 4/5, or 8 pi divided by 5. So here's what I'm going to encourage you to do. Now you know that this kind of splits in here, right? So we know that what I'm going to label this x-axis is I'm going to label this as 8/5 pi. Now I'm going to label the axis there. I'll show you what that allows me to do, but that's going to allow me to generate this period. The x and the y-axis, I know that my midline is -1, my amplitude is 3, so if I make this go by ones, that would be sufficient. So I'm just going to make it go by ones. And that's going to set my x and y-axis. Now, I get to move this dot 8 pi over 5 wherever I want. Here's the key, is think about what that means. That means in my little sine graph right here, that this value right here is 8 pi divided by 5. So if I just kind of move this so that I can split my graph into quarters, I should be good. So I'm going to go up to, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to start here. Say, okay, that's part of my sine graph. That's the peak of my sine graph. That's back to the middle of my sine graph. That's the lowest part of my sine graph, and that's the end. And so I just went up by 2s each way. That's going to allow me to adjust this curve to be right. I could go up by 3s, and anywhere where I split this, where I can split this into what I would call quarters. So the midline is -1. That's where my graph is going to start, at -1. And then the first cycle, so that's where this spot right here is, -1. The first cycle, I'm going to go up to here. And I need to go up 3 units from that. 1, 2, 3. So I need to get up to there. Then I know that I'm going to be back down here, back down to that part, back down to that midline. And then the next cycle I'm going to go down is 3 units lower than that. And then I'm going to get back up to my midline. And there, then it draws my nice graph. And it's this sine curve that goes from that period and over that amount, and it'll go through and show me, oh, there you go. So you want to kind of follow that along. That's going to take a little bit of practice. But you want to identify those 3 parts and then see if you can come up with the right graph and adjust that slider. Okay? You can stop the video now if you want to. I'm going to do one more example like this. So let me grab a new problem, and let me grab this one right here. Okay. So I got this equation, y equals sine 2x plus 4. Okay? So our amplitude is equal to 1. Our midline is y equals 4. Here's what we're dealing with our period. Our period is going to be 2 pi divided by 2, or just pi. So I'm going to label the x-axis as pi, so that way I can move that dot and make what I want it to work out to. I know my midline, I know I'm going to need to go up to 4, and then I'm only need to go up 1 higher. So I'm going to make my y-axis go by 1s, and I should be able to set that, and it kind of sets it for me. Well, I'm going to spread this one out a little bit more. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go from start at 0, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my first hump. And I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. That's midway through my period. And I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 3/4 of the way through my period. And I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to set pi right there. So I get to move where that period ends. Now I know I go, it's a sine curve. So I know that I am going to have a graph that starts up here and goes like this. And this is going to be pi. And this value right here is going to be 4. And I'm going to go up to 5. And I'm going to go down to 3. And I know that this is going to be pi over 2. So I kind of set this up, and that's the way this graph has to look. So I start at 4. I know that when I run to the middle, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, when I'm back at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I'm back there. I know right in the middle here, I'm going to go up to 5. And right in the middle here, I'm going to go down to 3. And there's my graph. And when I submit that answer, it's going to tell me that one's right. And it's going to draw a little nicer graph, but it's going to adjust it to where I put it. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that you can do some of those problems. They're really important to do this way so you understand how this graph kind of looks and what you can do to manipulate it.